Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video we'll be taking a look at Druids, primarily the DPS specs of Druid, the balance, and the feral, and talking about how both of them feel to play in the current version of Shadowlands Alpha. Now the numbers for Alpha are not fully tuned, so in this video I really just want to look at the playstyle and how it feels. I think the damage numbers aren't perfect for Druids. It feels certain abilities don't really feel the fantasy of what is intended, at least what I'm guessing is intended the playstyle to be. But at least we could take a look at how balanced Druid feels with the change they've gotten. Blizzard trying to reiterate on the new or old Eclipse system, and the small changes to feral and how it impacts the spec. Do any of them feel any better going from Battle for Azeroth? I spent hours trying to sit for a dungeon and trying to get myself a queue, but depending on the time of day, sometimes you get a lot of queues of people in the alpha, sometimes you don't. I really do hope Blizzard opens up more people in the alpha, mostly just so we can have more groups to run dungeons with, but that'll happen naturally over time. But I guess we'll just have to wait until the brand new build. Although I have put myself in a variety of different situations in the questing zones on Druid to at least get a little bit of idea. I simply just wanted to test out the gameplay loops and mostly what is new, what is different, what feels good, and what doesn't. Starting with Balanced Druid, we are going to be taking a look at the Eclipse system, which in a sense was an old system from back in Kata when I used to play some Boomkin, but I don't really know if this system is 100% recreated or it looks more like a modified version to be added into Shadowlands. Where in Battle for Azeroth, using abilities like Star Surge creates you empowerments for Lunar and Solar, which would give a buff to one of the two cast spells of the nature of Arcane variety. Now, in this video, we'll be naming those abilities with the same names that they have on the alpha. So instead of calling it Solar Wrath, we'll call it Wrath because that is its name on the alpha. Instead of Lunar Strike, Astral Strike, whichever one it's called in Battle for Azeroth, we'll call it Starfire, which is its original name and the name they're using it on the alpha. So the playstyle in Battle for Azeroth is you use Star Surge, which empowers one Wrath and one Starfire to do a little bit extra damage and have a slightly faster cast and have other effects. The empowerment system in Shadowlands is a little different, and I guess the best way I could describe it is talk about what it used to be back in Cataclysm. So back in Cata there was this little dial that would have lunar and solar phases and this dial in the middle. The more nature-based abilities you would use, the further this dial would be pushed in the opposite direction towards lunar. And the more lunar-based abilities or arcane-based abilities you used, the further this dial would be pushed into the solar. The idea is you're supposed to go from solar phase to lunar phase, and within different empowerments, when you push it all the way to the lunar, your arcane-based abilities do more damage, while in the solar, your nature-based abilities do more damage. To show this a little bit better, you can see the Moonfire damage before any empowerments. It does a little bit of damage, but the damage jumps up as soon as I enter a lunar eclipse. During a lunar eclipse, all lunar or arcane-based abilities do more damage, and that means you can snapshot your dot with a very powerful effect, and as long as you don't have to refresh this dot, you'll actually have a stronger version of Moonfire on the target. When I shift into the nature or the solar affinity, then I have nature damage increase, so my Sunfire damage will also be increased as a dot. Essentially, with the dots, you add a snapshot mechanic to Boomkins. So as you go from Eclipse to Eclipse, you try to make sure to leave a very powerful version of that dot on an enemy as you're about to leave that Eclipse. I do wonder if you'll have to hit Moonfire or Sunfire twice to make sure you have an extra long version because of pandemic. And with gear, I believe it might be easier to juggle and balance those dots, especially on a single target fight. In AoE, you do have Starfall that will increase the duration of your dots by 4 seconds, so maybe with high enough gear, in AoE you won't have to juggle those dots nearly as heavily, but in single target this seems to be a core mechanic for you. So you have two eclipses. In the Nature Eclipse or Solar Eclipse, you'll have nature abilities empowered. Your Wrath, which is a single target cast ability, and your Sunfire, which is a pretty big dot on AoE. It does a good single target damage over time, but it does have focus to AoE to be able to spread it to multiple enemies very quickly. Then you have your Arcane Empowerment or Arcane Eclipse or the Lunar Eclipse. In the Arcane Eclipse, your Arcane abilities do more damage. Your Moonfire, which is more of a single target dot or single target focus dot, and then your main cast of Starfire, which is a cast for mostly AoE focused. So you can see kind of the dynamic comes in within dungeons. Let's say in a dungeon you're about to go up against a trash bag. At the beginning of a fight, you can choose which eclipse you want to hit. Since you want to do more cleave damage to everybody evenly, you'll probably want to use Wrath in order to push yourself into the opposite eclipse, which will be the Lunar Eclipse. There you'll start smacking your enemies with big cleaves, dotting them up with Moonfire, making sure probably hit Sunfire as well right before you really get into the Eclipse, and then blasting the enemies with as many Starfires as possible in cleave. On a boss fight, instead you'll probably open up with dotting up the enemy just to get your dots up and running, and then use the opposite of nature abilities in order to force yourself into nature. So you start with arcane based abilities like your Starfire to force you into the nature or solar eclipse. In the solar, or what I would call as the nature eclipse, your nature abilities do more damage, so you'll rapid fire a bunch of wraths at the enemy and do a bunch of damage. Then you have abilities that are astral abilities, which are nature and arcane combined. So those will be your Starfall and those will be your Star Surge. These abilities do more damage when an eclipse is active, or when you have Celestial Alignment / Incarnation available. Both eclipses are active, which double buffs the ability, so it's able to double dip into both. Star Surge on its own extends your current eclipse, so if you like the eclipse you're in and you want to last it a little bit longer, you'll be using Star Surges inside of eclipses, not outside of them. If you have a dot heavy playstyle, then you can use Starfall to extend those dots even further. Essentially, the Boomkin playstyle doesn't really change too much. You'll still be Moonfiring, Sunfiring, Wrathing, and Star Surging. Just the focus of abilities and spamming certain ability because of an Eclipse is going to be a pretty big priority. The one thing that you will not be able to do much about the Eclipses is you won't be able to double dip into Solar or Lunar. Once you enter Solar Eclipse, let's say for a boss fight, you'll go in, dot up your enemy, do a bunch of Star Surges and Wraths, and then the game will kind of force you to go into Lunar Eclipse. There will be an internal cooldown before you can enter a Solar Eclipse, as the game kind of wants for you to go from Solar to Lunar, from Solar to Lunar. The only thing you'll be able to choose in the fight is which Eclipse you start in. So let's say in the trash bag in Mythic Plus Dungeon, you want to do more cleave, you'll be able to use Wraths in order to activate Lunar Eclipse. Or in a boss fight, you'll be able to use Starfires in order to activate Solar Eclipse. And then from there, you'll kind of have to go from one Eclipse into the other. So the game is going to have a very specific playstyle, where in Battle for Azeroth, you could use Star Surge and then use Wraths and Starfires as you wanted. So in a boss fight, you'll probably throw your Wraths first before you start using Starfires, since Starfire is more of a cleave-based ability. But in a dungeon setting, you'll probably use your Starfires earlier because that does a bit of extra cleave, and then you use your Wraths. Well, since you have empowered Wraths, you might as well use them. But the game was more about maintaining and using as many Star Surges as possible, or as many Starfalls, since that was your biggest hitter. With this, the focus changes from using as many Star Surges and Starfalls as possible to trying to get into a Eclipse and trying to prolong the damage and use as many abilities inside of that Eclipse. So the game is going to be pretty rigid in terms of how it wants you to play it. This isn't a bad thing, but Blizzard needs to be very careful on numbers, because some numbers feel good, some don't. Like Wrath, for example, really feels underwhelming, while Starfire feels quite good. So going into Lunar FX, at least on boss fights or single target or AoE cleaves, your Starfire and Lunar phases feel much better to play than going into Solar Eclipses. If they buff the damage of Wrath to be a lot stronger for single target, since you're able to rapid fire it, I feel like that'll feel a lot better. But so far, yeah, the numbers need to be perfect on this. So the playstyle don't feel too terrible. It doesn't really take a lot to get into the groove of things, but it is weird. I'm not gonna lie, it is weird when you don't have that big payoff. And right now in the alpha, not all the numbers are finalized, and right now going into Solar Affix doesn't feel nearly as big of a payoff as going into Lunar Affix. But once the numbers are normalized, this actually is not a terrible playstyle. It is going to be weird, and what I'm hoping is that this playstyle change, empowering your Starfires with Lunar Affix, increases your AoE cleave, because Boomkins have had really poor AoE cleave in Battle for Azeroth. They had really good single target. If this change fixes and makes their AoE cleave a little bit better, then I think the spec will be miles better for Mythic Plus Dungeons. On the other hand, Feral didn't really change too much. The spec itself has exactly the same abilities as before. There are a couple talent changes, and I've been able to test out the spec. The one thing I will say, on current Battle for Azeroth, not a lot of people play Feral. There's maybe like 5 people that play Feral. Of course, it's an exaggeration, but it's nowhere near as popular of a spec as some of the other ones up there. And since Blizzard isn't really changing the spec, they're not really making it feel better or worse. They're not really making it feel any different. So if you were happy with the way Feral played in the past, with its resource generation between energy, combo points, being very crit oriented, then the spec didn't really change too much. So some of you guys may be happy to hear that. How big are the Feral's bleeds? On the alpha right now, Feral bleeds do okay amount of damage. They don't seem to be front and center. And what I would love for Feral Druids is to have majority, the top damage of their abilities be bleeds, rakes, thrashes, and rips. That would be my favorite. And it seems to be that currently on the alpha, bleeds do an okay amount of damage, but still a good portion of it will be supplemented by shreds and bites. The new talent of Blood Talents doesn't feel that weird to play with. Normally with Blood Talents you would need to use Regrowth or Entangling Roots, and then your next two abilities will snapshot for a bigger bleed. With the change to Blood Talents, you will now need to use Shred, Rake, and Thrash in any succession, so you can really mix around which ability you use first or last. But as long as you use these three abilities in succession back to back, then your next two rips or ferocious bites will be empowered. So it means that your rake will no longer have an extra bleed, but the buff to rips and bites is 30%, so it is quite hefty. So to maintain a bigger rip is going to be fairly easy for most feral druids. And if you're running a talent of Sabertooth, bites will prolong those rips and bites will do more damage. Sabertooth together with this buff will give you pretty meaty bites. It is weird to get used to using those abilities in combo, especially in single target since Thrash does very little single target damage. It's mostly a bleed you would put up on enemies in AoE to increase the damage of your swipes. Just an easy bleed to just throw on things. But this does not feel all that bad and can be used easily in the opener. In the opener, you can open up on a rake on an enemy to put up a stronger version of that rake bleed into a shred, into a thrash, and then you can throw down a rip. And then from there, with Sabertooth, you can maintain that rip forever. From time to time in the fight, you'll need to refresh your rake anyway. So when you go to refresh your rake, if you have enough energy, if you want to shred into a thrash, then you can maintain those bite combos almost forever. It's really easy to do. It takes a little bit of practice, but with the energy regen that Feral has in the current alpha, it does feel a little weird. Already with Feral Druids, I can feel that gear is going to make a huge change in terms of the playstyle. Already I'm finding myself just kind of praying for crits so I get extra common points, and when you have enough crit, when you have enough of any stat with gear, then Feral is going to feel a lot smoother to play. But on the alpha, the gear that we're given is really low. So unless you're perfectly comfortable and used to playing around with Target's Fury, which is your one button to gain you a lot of energy, generating common points and managing energy with low crit just doesn't feel that great. Crit lets you get extra common points for a single ability, so in a global where you would use Shred and get 1 common point normally, instead you can get 2 common points instead, making the spec a little bit easier to play overall. It means managing your bleeds uptime is a lot easier, getting more bites into the enemies a lot easier, and getting more value for a single global just feels nice. It feels like it fits to the playstyle of the spec that doesn't have the greatest energy regen. So let me show you a playstyle that I actually tried on the alpha that I enjoyed with Feral, but right before that, Blood Talents does work with Primal Wrath. I want to make sure you guys were aware. Blood Talents increases the damage of your next rips and ferocious bites, and Primal Wrath counts as a rip. So if you're worrying that you were losing this big AoE combo of Blood Talents, Primal Wrath, it still isn't a game. You'll just activate Blood Talents in a slightly different way. But I'm going to be honest, the energy regen for Feral in the alpha kind of bugged me, so I tried a different build together with Sabertooth, Savage Roar, and Moment of Clarity. I went Savage Roar so I can get 10% more damage, but most importantly, 10% more energy regeneration rate while in cat form. It felt like my energy regen was very sluggish, and with not enough crit, it just didn't feel quite as satisfying. Moment of Clarity, I was kind of hoping to, well, I'm going to be dropping Blood Talents as the extra damage increase, but hopefully Moment of Clarity procs more often, and the 50% extra damage to some of my other free abilities might feel nice. Now, personally, I would love for a Feral Druid to be literally an Affliction Warlock, but as a cat. Put up the strongest and the perfect version of Affliction Warlock, the biggest rot damage ever. Biggest thrashes, biggest rakes and rips, and just basically be able to AFK majority of the fight, just watching the bleeds melt the boss. That would be my proper best fantasy Feral Druid that I could ever imagine in my head. But I don't know if that's exactly what we're getting here on Shadowlands. The build that I found myself to be playing with the high energy regen and kind of procs of Moment of Clarity, RNG and stuff actually was very enjoyable. I think the changes to the rip that they made in Shadowlands, where rip does its full damage, the only thing common points determine is how long the rip lasts. You can basically juggle and maintain a 1 or 2 common point rip in most cases, let's say when you're low on procs, and they will still do the full damage that it could. Yeah, it doesn't really play into this bleed heavy focused Feral that I would love for Blizzard to really, focus on. But without Blizzard really focusing and really making bleeds a priority, since Feral is mostly staying the same as it was in BFA, where bleeds are a portion of your damage, but not the highlight of your damage, then it seems to be that we are still going to be biting and shredding and thrashing and doing all those things with bleeds and claws and bites and paws, and the damage overall is going to be supplemented by bleeds. It's going to be a side of the damage but not the main priority. So going for this high energy build felt really good to play, and maybe potentially this will be something Ferals can play when the expansion starts. I'm pretty sure with everybody starting out with better gear, like heroic or mythic Ny'alotha gear, going to Shadowlands, you'll have plenty of resources to play the builds that you want. But I kind of enjoyed the fact that you could make this energy heavy build, and I very much enjoyed the ability to be able to get more shreds and more bites and manage more resources far easier. So I think this is good. I don't really see Ferals run Savage Roar ever, so it was great to be able to run a talent that I see almost nobody else run, and to have it actually be kind of fun and good and create a really good feeling playstyle was actually quite enjoyable. And maybe this potentially means that on the alpha, other people might be able to run a similar build and have similar experience, or maybe I just got real lucky with some of the procs in the build, and that's really all it comes down to. But overall, Feral didn't really feel too terrible once I found this build. Prior to this, it felt a little bit rough, not gonna lie. Maybe one day Blizzard will make Feral that's all focused about bleeds and dots and rots, but for now it doesn't seem to be an expansion to it, but still, Feral is pretty fun either way. So hopefully I was able to capture fairly well how it feels to play Druid, whether you're playing Balance or Feral. The numbers aren't final in the alpha, so you shouldn't be really looking at the numbers fully. Numbers are going to be adjusted as the last thing of every alpha and beta, at least that's what everybody else tells me. So numbers we should focus on as the very last thing in priority. But the way that the spec feels, I found that energy regen build with Feral quite fun, and Boomkin doesn't feel too bad. And hopefully the numbers will be adjusted in order to account them to be doing decent damage at least. Thank you guys so much for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see all of you guys in another video.